You're right. It would be very good if I'd known that when I was 22.
Oh yeah, and I mean, it would have made a big impact on how my relationship went. It would have made a big impact on how I had, raised my kids differently.
Guys, we're
Yeah.
already rolling. Also, no one has any clue what you're talking about.
Hi, I'm Jeff.
I'm John, and hey, Jeff and I were just kind of talking about this idea that when we were young, our parents provided a lot of things for us that we were really, quite honestly, not aware of and maybe not very grateful for, who knows.
Yeah.
But they provided a lot of things for us and taught us a lot of things about money and relationships that we just had no clue about.
Right.
And as we get older and have started to understand the importance of those things, and the impact that it's had on us, and quite frankly, some of the challenges that that's created in our marriages. If we had understood the power of some of those things earlier, and known that we could have made some different choices when it came to how we did money in our relationships, and kind of how we taught our kids about things like that, it would have made a massive difference.
Big difference.
But I also want to say, I don't think it matters what age you learn this in, or what age you start discovering this. Any age, it's important to start picking it up and deciding what it is that you want people around you to know.
Reminds me, I think maybe this saying was one you said to me first. It's the one about the tree, planting the tree. When's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Or today?
Yeah. So it's never too late to start. And, one of the things that we don't want to do is we don't want to look back 20 years from now and say, man, we really should have done some things differently.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, you know what I think is cool? I think rivers are cool.
Rivers are cool. I suspect there's an analogy coming.
I love analogies. Yeah, so, I grew up in the West, and I grew up doing quite a bit of fishing, fly fishing, that kind of stuff, outdoorsy. And I love rivers. I love standing in them. I love standing next to them. I love walking along them. And one of the things that often hits me is I'm standing there watching the movement of the river and trying to kind of pick out pieces of water, which is a strange idea, but you just watch this piece going along, is you find yourself going, this thing never stops. This river has been running for years, maybe thousands of years. And you can't help but wonder, where's this thing start and how does it come together? And where's it going? And how has it changed over time? I mean, rivers just have this amazing, consistent movement to them. And I kind of think about what we're talking about here as this is a great analogy for it, because these rivers are a lot like the learning that's happened in our lives. So, for instance, when I was in 7th grade, we learned about the water cycle, the evaporative cycle of water. And basically it says that, hey, it rains in the mountains and it trickles into little streams, and those eventually come down into tributaries, and they come into rivers that go past me and make me wonder things. And then they flow down into the ocean, and from there, it evaporates out of the ocean, goes into clouds, and we repeat the whole cycle. So, going back to this learning idea, where did I learn all of this stuff about money? How did I get so set in my ways on the things that I think are normal? How did I get that? And I'm married to somebody who doesn't think the same way, who grew up on a different river.
Learn different things.
Learn different things. Going back to water again, like I said, I grew up in the West, and there's hardly anything in the West that's more important or relevant than water. But not everybody in the West grows up with an abundance. In fact, either you grew up with an abundance of water or a scarcity of water. There's really not a lot of middle in the West. You're either where it rains a lot or you're in the desert. So, if you grew up in Arizona or Southern California, your ideas about water and how you use it and what normal water usage is for you is totally different than somebody that grows up in Seattle and can't ever get their shoes to dry out. So it's just a very different experience.
Yeah.
And you get those people together and they don't really realize what they've learned and how their values are different coming from those different places. This is the beginning of a 4-part video series on how it is that our parents provided for us and what we learned from that, the messages that we learned about our stuff and money and how that affects our relationships. This is video 1. So where we want to end this series is we want to end with the idea that if I could understand how it is that I was taught, if I can understand what I was taught, and then evaluate whether that was helpful, and then I can take that to my relationship and help my spouse understand what they learned about money and stuff. And then we could choose together, I don't know, maybe choose together what it is we really want for ourselves and our family.
Be intentional.
To be intentional about it. Maybe we could really have a huge impact of rerouting this river to a place that we want it to go so that it's useful and helpful in accomplishing things we want. Otherwise, guess what? The river just runs for 1,000 years and it just does what it does naturally. Yeah. And so this idea, we want to end with this idea of intentionality. It's going to take some curiosity. It's going to take some time together to explore where all of this comes from. The great ironies of learning, and Jeff, I'm going to ask you to plug in on this too, is that we have to learn a lot of things as children before we're ever in a position to evaluate what we've learned. Even to become aware that we're learners, we have to learn a lot of things.
Yeah, that's right. So
I don't know what age it is that I started looking at the things that I'd been taught as a kid and evaluating whether they were complete or helpful or accurate. When does that start taking place?
You know, of course, it happens across the developmental trajectory in pieces, right?
Okay.
The really big one, the one I know you're feeling, is when your kids are college age. And then they have an awareness that you're just a guy.
Who did everything wrong.
Yes. Yes. And they're trying to know what it means to be self-aware and to move into the world sort of independent from you.
Yeah. And of course, some of that starts early. We hear, kids come home, oh, so and such a teacher, taught me this, and, he's stupid. So, we start evaluating the messages that we get. But please keep in mind that there is a lot of water, a lot of learning that flowed before you even became aware to evaluate it.
I think language is a good example of that. You're starting to say pieces of words and then a whole word before you really understand what language is.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, something else I want to add here too is it's entirely possible that the messages that you learned about money and about what your normal is weren't helpful. It's entirely possible that what you learned wasn't accurate. And it's also possible that what you learned was not what your parents were trying to teach you. Sometimes we as parents think our kids are getting it. We did this, we did this, we did this. It seems to make its own sense. But sometimes we know growing up that we got really strange messages from the things that we observed.
Yeah, obviously parents are communicating intentionally or unintentionally all the time, and some of the messages that are sent out are not in their awareness, and also not in ours.
Right. And oddly enough, you actually started learning about things like money, relationships, and even, dare I say, economics when you were 2 and 3 years old. So what I want you to think...
What do you mean by you're learning economics when you're 2 or 3 years old?
Sure. Certainly your parents had some sort of a chalkboard and they went through and taught supply... No. You didn't learn supply and demand as a 3-year-old, but you did learn some pretty amazing things about money itself. And we're going to give you a short little list here, and I want you to follow along. And Jeff, what are some of the things that kids learn at a very early age about money?
Well, money can buy you things that you want.
Yeah. So, you know really fast as a kid how to get what you want because your parents are the gatekeepers for all of that stuff. And it doesn't take you long to realize that if you want something, there's going to be money involved in that transaction or process. Right. You learn that quick.
And you had to get money from someone who had it.
Yes.
Right?
And you find out pretty quick that grandparents have money or aunts and uncles have money. And maybe your neighbors have money, which brings us to the next point.
And most people don't want to give you money.
So if you go up to your neighbors and you go, hey, can I have $5? You might get a strange answer. Yeah. And even as a young person, you start learning where these guardrails are of who can I ask for money and who can I not.
Yeah, so you're saying asking for money is complicated.
Asking for money is complicated. You know that as an adult or as a teen, depending on the size of the ask, depending on the nature of the ask, things could go really south really quick.
Yeah.
And there was also this huge wild card of you never knew what kind of mood your parents were in. You didn't know what kind of maybe financial situation they were in at the moment.
Sure.
And so none of these lessons that you learned were set in stone that if I do A, B, and C, then I'm going to get D.
Right. And I think the last one is, once you spend the money, it's gone.
Yeah. That's a rough one to realize that, once we make a decision with money, even as kids, we realize that whether it was a good decision or a bad decision, that transaction is over. So all these observations are easy to make, kind of as an adult reflecting back as a child. But as a child, there's messages that you're getting, there's lessons that you're learning that quite frankly are confusing. So let me give you an example.
Okay.
Let's say it's your birthday.
Okay.
And you get some nice presents and you get 2 cards in the mail, one from a grandparent and one from an uncle.
Okay.
And in the grandparent envelope, there's a $10 bill. And from the uncle, there's a $100 bill.
Yeah.
What do you do with that?
What do you do with that?
Well, you really like your uncle, is what you do.
Okay.
So, we've all learned that there are certain people that are going to, do more things for us or that don't view money the same way as somebody else. And so, does that mean that grandparents aren't as giving? Does that mean that my uncle really likes me? There's a lot of messages that as a kid you probably aren't in any position to make sense of, but that's not going to keep you from trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, you're saying that people, when they're little, we all try to struggle to figure out what a given thing means.
Yes.
And so if it's $10, $100, we're sorting out in our head like, okay, does this mean my grandma doesn't love me and my uncle does, or whatever?
Yeah, and we're inevitably going to get the wrong answers on a fair amount of this because
interpret it wrong.
We're going to interpret it wrong.
I just want to remind you that we have a course which is called More Than a Budget, and you can go to relational-media.com to check it out. It's really cool. It goes deeper into these subjects, and we'd love for you to check it out.
So the bottom line is that your parents made thousands of financial decisions on how to spend their resources to help provide for you. And the choices that they made added up over time to create a normal that you experienced.
Okay.
Now, granted, that normal may have changed over time. We'll get into that. But I want to kind of look at some of the decisions that your parents made and how those things, I want you to think about how those affected the normal that you currently are experiencing today. So here's some of the things that your parents made decisions about with their dollars. Jeff?
Things like where you lived.
Yes.
Okay. And like what you would eat, like groceries or...
Yeah. Even, what's comfort food in your family? What's a normal meal in your family? What's holiday food in your family?
Out?
Yeah. Do you eat out most of your meals or do you eat in? What else?
Like how you dressed?
Sure. As a kid, what brands were you going to be, were you going to be buying Nikes or were you going to be buying something other? How did you access clothing? There were parameters on how that all took place.
What about like vacation?
Vacation's a big deal. I mean, where you traveled, how you traveled, if you traveled. Obviously, you probably are with somebody who grew up very differently in how they understood the word vacation.
Okay. All right. Like, well, you're saying traveling, but I'm wondering, how you get from A to B.
Yeah. So as a kid, you were hauled around in a car or a truck or a van and
a bus.
A bus, and that was the way that if you grew up in a big city, that was the way that you did transportation. And that became normal to you. And then at some point in time, somehow you got your first car. And that was, how did that happen? All of those things have meaning. They all are, part of this script that makes up what we think is not great or not bad, but just are normal. Is there anything else that you can think of?
I mean, education, like where you went to school, private school, or?
Yeah, and this even gets obviously into college. How was college paid for? Was college paid for? Was college an option? All of these things kind of give us information about who we are and where our place in the world is.
Yeah, I can think of one more.
What's that?
Healthcare?
Yeah, is that something that was easy for you? Do you remember going to the doctor as being a simple experience? Do you remember, if there was a small emergency, were you cared for at home, or were you taken to multiple doctors to get it worked out? If you got hurt, was the first thing that your parents said, "We can't afford this. You've done something terrible to our budget," or are you even aware that healthcare is expensive?
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Now, we could keep that list going. Jeff provided some great ideas, but I mean, you could literally come up with pages and pages of things that we all experienced as kids that we really had very limited say in how we received it.
It just happened.
It just happened.
Yeah.
And maybe every once in a while there was a message that came with it. You know, like we talked about with healthcare. I can't believe you got hurt in football because we can't afford to, put a cast on your leg.
Yeah, right.
What message did that teach you? How did you kind of process all of those
Even
kinds
I'm
of
thinking
things?
even the nonverbals. Like even if
absolutely.
even if they didn't say overtly, we can't afford to put a cast on your foot. I can imagine the sighs or the palm to forehead.
Yeah.
Or even like just the intensely worried, just super anxious. Like what are we going to do now?
Right.
Yeah.
So remember that normal is a loaded word. I'm not saying that normal is good or bad. I'm just saying that it is the way that you experienced money being used in your childhood. That's how you think. That's how you look back and experience your raising, if you will, financially. But in the end, understand that all of these things together, all of these decisions that were made, all these things that were purchased or not purchased, make up what I like to call your financial culture. Just like we think of somebody that comes from a different country as having a different culture than us. You may have figured out that your spouse or your partner, they come from a family that's really weird.
Okay.
And again, I'm making fun here, but weird is something other than me. So maybe their culture was different. Their holidays were different. Their summers were different. The way that they communicate with each other, the things they joke about. Well, financially, we have a financial culture that says this is how we normally do things. And depending on how you were raised, you have a financial culture that is unique to you. And then one last thing I want to talk about is how financial culture changes over time. So, if you grew up in a family of, let's say, 4 siblings, and you were the firstborn, it's entirely possible that the financial normal that you grew up in is vastly different than the financial normal of the last kid to come through the pipe. And that goes back to our river, right? Streams start as small and they get bigger typically as they go. It is a normal pattern. It's a common pattern that families become a little bit more financially stable over the years. So maybe the first child grew up in more scarcity, with more restrictions and more worry. And the last one is just like, hey, whatever, I can buy whatever, we can go wherever, we do whatever.
Could this go the other direction?
It can absolutely. In fact, there's really no rhyme or reason when we get back to individuals. When we talk about averages, it's great. Here's but no one is an average. So for instance, maybe you grew up in a family that financially benefited by time. Maybe you grew up in a family, quite frankly, that was doing well, and then at some point in time in your life, the bottom fell out. Okay. Maybe the family business failed, or there was a health issue, or a death, or a loss of something. And all of a sudden you had to deal with an economic change of your normal that blew everything up. Yeah. Maybe you grew up in a family that was like watching paint dry as far as finances go. Nothing ever changed. You ate the same 5 meals, you wore the same brand of clothes, everything was programmed and level. Or maybe you grew up in a family that was 2 self-employed people or contract labor, and one year it was great and the next year it was terrible, and you could never figure out where you were. I think you could imagine that would have a fairly important impact on how somebody kind of views the world and finances.
For sure.
Okay, so let's start wrapping up video 1. So if you're watching this first video, you might be starting to think that the things that you learned about money and family are a little bit complex.
Sometimes what happened to you when you were younger has a profound or important impact on what is happening, what kind of financial decisions you're making today.
And then thirdly, you might actually learn that the things that are normal to you are going to be different than the things that are normal than your spouse. And those things in and of themselves may be creating conflict. They may be creating a challenge in your relationship as to which way you go, which normal you follow together as a couple. So if you're thinking about all of those 3 things and you're going, yeah, that's pretty important, then I want you to know, good. You should be thinking that. That's what we want you to think. And going past that, if now thinking about that, you're saying, hey, maybe we should be curious about how we got here.
Yeah.
Maybe we should be curious about what lessons what lessons we learned as kids about money and about what is the normal way to live or a right way to live.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should be curious and be looking into those things. And then maybe we could take that one step further.
Yeah.
And as a couple really decide what is it that we want to provide for our kids and how are we going to communicate about those things so that they don't get the wrong message.
Yeah.
And maybe that would help them not have some of the same struggles that we're having now as a couple. And if you're thinking that way, then you're doing great.
Yeah.
So we want you to stay curious about these things. We're going to go further in the next 3 videos, but stick with us.
Hey, if you like our videos, hit the like button and subscribe. It would really help us to grow our channel, and we really appreciate when you do that. Also, remember that we have a course.
Mm-hmm.
It's called More Than a Budget, and it's on our website, which is relational-media.com. So go check it out.
And hey, stay curious.